ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله وصلى الله وسلم على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اهتدى بهديه إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد. So continuing on with our topic, which is the history and the development of Islamic law. And we've spoken about fiqh in the time of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een and the followers of the Tabi'een. And we've spoken about how the fiqh of the four madhahib received the fiqh of the different scholars from the Tabi'een, and then continued that. And Allah Ta'ala willed that the opinions of the four madhahib are the ones that remain. That's simply how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed for things to remain. Otherwise, if the madhab of Sufyan al-Thawri, as we said, or the madhab of al-Awza'i, or any other scholar stayed instead of the madhab of Malik or the madhab of Ahmad, would that have been a problem? It would not have been a problem. Because the point here is that we have scholars who are qualified and capable of interpreting the Quran, interpreting the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and the Muslims are following their religion in accordance with an appropriate and a proper understanding of the Quran and Sunnah, and that's enough. Whether that comes from Ahmad or Malik or Sufyan or Dawood or anyone else, there's not a problem. We mentioned that the madhahib are vast schools of law. Okay, the madhahib are vast schools of law, and a lot exists within any one madhab. We spoke about the issue of relying on a madhab and following a madhab, and we've looked briefly at taqleed, the issue of taqleed. The asl is that Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, اتَّبِعُوا مَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْكُم مِّن رَبِّكُم, follow that which has been revealed from your Lord. اتَّبِعُوا مَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْكُم مِّن رَبِّكُم. And that's the rule. How does a person follow what has been revealed by Allah Ta'ala? We have a book, the Quran, and we have a messenger who was sent to clarify that Quran, to explain the Quran, to explain how we should live by that Quran and how we should implement it. And as the Prophet ﷺ says, Al-ulama warathatul anbiya. The ulama, the scholars, are the inheritors of the prophets. The scholars are the inheritors of the prophets. So the same role of the prophet of clarifying the Quran is also the same role of the scholars. And that's why Allah in the Quran refers to them as what? He says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ. What's dhikr? Quran. إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرِ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. We have sent down the dhikr and we shall preserve it. وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الذِّكْرَ لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِّلَ إِلَيْهِمْ. We've sent down the dhikr, the Quran, so that you may show people what has, or clarify to people what has been revealed to them. So, just as the Prophet ﷺ was sent to clarify the Quran, Allah Ta'ala refers to the scholars of Islam as people of the Quran. Why? Because their job is to explain the Quran. Their job is to clarify the Quran. So, just as people would refer back to the Messenger ﷺ for a correct understanding of the Quran, Allah has ensured that every generation has scholars who can be referred back to in order to explain to people the Quran. And when I say the Quran, I mean the deen, the whole religion, because the whole religion comes from the Quran. Don't think that the Quran, because it's limited in its amount, limited in number of verses, we imagine that it's limited in terms of its knowledge. No. Everything goes back to the Quran. Everything goes back to the Quran. The Sunnah is what? All the ahadith that we know all go back to the Quran. It's all a matter of going back to the Quran and being an explanation of the Quran. Okay? And so that's something that is important to understand. Now, taqleed is what? Taqleed is to follow another person. Taqleed is to follow another individual on what they are saying. As we said, taqleed can have different meanings, and it can be for different reasons, and it can be from different people. So the ruling differs depending on the individual. The vast majority of people make taqleed. The vast majority of people make taqleed. And this is why Muwaffaq al-Din ibn Qudama, rahimahullah ta'ala, the famous Hanbali scholar, says that the scholars have agreed that upon the non-scholar, the one who's not a scholar, it's permissible upon him to make taqleed. قَالَ بَلْ يَجِبْ. In fact, it is compulsory for him to make taqleed of the right people. Yeah? This is the statement of Ibn Qudama rahimahullah ta'ala, and he's quoting a consensus. Why is it compulsory? Because it's necessary for the person who's not a scholar to ensure that his understanding of the Quran and the understanding of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ is understood properly, is understood correctly. And that's why this is important. In fact, Imam Ahmad rahimahullah would even advise his students are scholars. We're talking about people like Abu Dawood, Sulaiman ibn al-Ash'ath Sijistani, the famous scholar of hadith, and his like. He would advise them to what? قال إياك أن تقول قولا ليس لك فيه إمام. Beware of saying an opinion which you don't have an imam for, which you don't have a precedent for, a scholar of Islam to precede you. So even the scholars are commanded and advised to never go against previous scholarship. So let alone the person who's not a scholar. And as we said, taqleed is a continuum. How much taqleed you make depends on how much knowledge you have. The less knowledge a person has, the more they're simply going to have to follow a person who does have knowledge. That making of taqleed, it can be through following one of the four madhahib, and it can be through not following one of the four madhahib. Both are called taqleed. Whether you follow a person whether you follow one of the four madhahib or someone who doesn't ascribe to one of the four madhahib, or whoever you follow, following them is called taqleed. Following them is called taqleed. And as we said, the less knowledge a person has, the more they'll have to resort to taqleed. The more knowledge they have, the less they'll be restricted. And this is why you'll find that the most knowledgeable scholars are the ones who follow the least. They're not in need of following any specific individual. Whereas those people of knowledge or students of knowledge who are less knowledgeable, you'll find that they are more and more in need of referring back to the scholars of their madhab, for example. Or just simply saying, this is what the scholars say. This is what our scholars say. And these categories of scholars exist in every madhab. Every madhab has scholars of ijtihad mutlaq. And it has scholars who maybe are not as confident in opposing the opinions of a madhab, but they just simply pass on what the previous scholars have said. And in the Hanafi madhab, for example, we have people like Al-Qadi Abu Yusuf and Muhammad ibn Hassan. We have people like Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi. These are scholars of ijtihad, mutlaq. They have the freedom to stay in the madhab, outside the madhab, do what they wish. In the Hanbali madhab, we have the same. We have people like Abu Dawood, the muhaddith, even though he's not officially a Hanbali, but he's a student of Imam Ahmad. We have people like Abu al-Wafa ibn Aqil, people like Ibn Qudama, people like Ibn Taymiyyah, people like Ibn Qayyim. These are scholars of ijtihad. No one can say to them, why did you not stick to the madhab? Why does he have to stick to the madhab? He's a scholar of ijtihad. There's no difference between him and between a scholar of the past. This is one thing you'll find throughout history. Throughout history, the scholars, rahimahumullah, belittled their generation more and more. Every generation belittles its own generation, and it thinks highly of the previous generation, which has positives and it has some weaknesses as well. It brings some problems as well. The positives is that people are not disrespecting scholarship that comes before them. And Allah commands us in the Quran to make dua for the believers who came before us. However, one of the harms it brought is that it made people think that the generation that they're living in has zero knowledge, and all the knowledge is in the previous generations, which is also an exaggeration. And that's why some of the scholars said the door of ijtihad is closed. What does that mean? It means that no one is allowed to make ijtihad anymore. Ijtihad means what? Ijtihad means putting an effort into extracting rulings from the Quran and Hadith. That's what ijtihad is. Yeah? Some scholars said ijtihad is no longer permissible after the 4th or 5th century. No longer permissible. Why is it not permissible? Because they belittled their generation. Just because somebody lived 500 years ago, does that make them more knowledgeable? Abu Lahab and Abu Jahl lived with the Prophet ﷺ. The scholars of today are more knowledgeable than Abu Jahl and Abu Lahab. Generation doesn't make a person more knowledgeable or less knowledgeable. There's no reason why a person cannot be as knowledgeable as a scholar who came before them. Some generations have the virtue because they have the ta'deel of the Prophet ﷺ. So the first 3 generations, for example, are given their status because their status was given to them by the Prophet ﷺ. خَيْرُ النَّاسِ قَرْنِي, the best of people are my generation. ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ, then those who come after them and those who come after them. That's a general statement. It doesn't necessarily mean that every person who lived in the time of the tabi'een is more knowledgeable than every person who came after them. Not necessarily. It doesn't mean that. Is it possible for someone living in this generation, this century, to be more knowledgeable than someone who lived 50 years after the Prophet ﷺ? Is it possible? Huh? Why would it not be possible?
It's possible.
Exactly. But sometimes there is that feeling of, no, our generation, how can our generation come with that generation before? That's fine, that's a general rule. As a general rule, those generations were more pious and more righteous and had a better and clearer understanding of the deen, and more corruption occurred as time went on, as a general statement. But that does not mean that no scholar in this century has the ability to extract rulings from the Quran and Sunnah. There's no reason for that. There's no reason for that whatsoever. In fact, that just restricts knowledge. It really does. It restricts knowledge unnecessarily. Yes, people have to go through a specific structure of learning before they can reach a level where they can speak about knowledge and so on. No problem. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the doors are closed. The doors are open till the Day of Judgment. Because Allah, when He tells us to refer back to the scholars, what does that mean? That means there's always going to be scholars who are capable. Yeah? So we spoke about following a madhab. What did we say are some of the benefits of following a madhab? We said all the scholars, generally speaking, after the 4 imams, generally speaking, 99% or more of the scholars would ascribe themselves to one of the 4 madhab. Yeah? Some of them would keep within the madhab a lot. Some of them would go against the madhab a lot. Some of them maybe didn't stick to the madhab too much. Others did. That's not the point. The point is there is that ascribing oneself to a madhab, one of the 4 madhab. So we said that's permissible. There's no issue. So long as it doesn't lead, as we said, to things that are not permissible. What are some of the benefits of following a madhab?
Clear understanding of the deen.
طيب, a clear understanding, consistent understanding. Consistent understanding. And if you don't go according to a specific structure in learning the Sharia, you'll find it very difficult. You'll find it very difficult. And this is why you'll find someone who maybe is attending classes of knowledge for 40 years. But how much he takes away is restricted. Why? Because there's no structure. There's no structure to learning. Every time there's an event or a conference or a lecture or speech, he might attend. But there's no proper structure to this. Whereas the one who spends 5 years or 6 years focusing on studying fiqh according to one approach, in 5-6 years he'll become a scholar. If he does it full time and he does it with the right people, don't be surprised at that. And you don't be surprised that a person becomes a... Why do you think people, many of the scholars throughout history, started writing books and started giving Fettah and so on at a young age? In their late teens and 20s and so on. Scholars until today have written exceptional books when they're only in their 20s. Early 20s, mid 20s, late 20s. Why? Because they studied. They put the effort in. From an early age they put the effort in. So that's one of the benefits. What else is there? It gives you a structure in learning. So the student of knowledge who wants to study fiqh, really, they're not going to have much success unless you take with one of the madhahib and then follow it through. What else is the benefit?
Clearing the confusion, because sometimes when you follow too many madhab, you get confused about certain things.
Okay, so when
Shaykh of your your iman a little bit.
طيب, so when it comes to following the religion itself, practicing it, it ensures that you're following it in a proper way. Not every time you hear an opinion, you change the way you pray. Every time you hear an opinion, you change the way you fast. Today this broke your fast, tomorrow it didn't break your fast. That can bring confusion. Why? Because your opinions always exist. And all the opinions are going to have some evidence. All opinions have some evidence, otherwise they wouldn't be opinions in the first place. But those evidences can be strong, and those evidences can be not very strong. Even people who have deviant and corrupt beliefs, do you think that they hold these opinions without proof? No one would take them seriously if they had no proof. They have to have some proof. They have to have some sort of proof. Some of the worst of opinions and views, people use the Quran to back them up. People use the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ to back them up. So if every time a person hears an opinion with a bit of proof, he's convinced and he changes his view and his understanding, that causes a lot of clashing, a lot of conflict, a lot of problems. When I say people have evidence, that doesn't mean they have proper evidence. A person of knowledge will be able to distinguish. He'll say this evidence is useless, this evidence is no good, or this evidence is a fabrication. Or how can you understand it like this when there are so many verses that say this? But unfortunately the majority of people can't pick that up. Most people can't pick that up. That's why last week one of our Shaykh I was speaking to, he says when people try to deceive others, they know that there are people of knowledge out there who catch them out. So when someone comes in to criticize an opinion that is accepted by all scholars, or someone comes to criticize a hadith that's accepted by all scholars, or a book of hadith that is accepted by all scholars, this person who's critical of these things, he knows that there are scholars out there who can catch him out easily. But the problem is, 95% of people aren't those scholars who can catch things out. So he knows that he's addressing them. If they speak against me, they say whatever, not a problem. But these guys won't have any response to that. They'll be convinced. So when following one of these four madhahib, you know and you're confident that you're following an opinion that throughout Islamic history has been accepted by the scholars. It's an opinion that's been accepted by the scholars. And that gives you confidence. One human being is not necessarily accepted. One human being, you don't know, he might be knowledgeable, he might not be knowledgeable. So if your whole religion is based on his understanding, that's a bit of a risk. But if your understanding of the deen is based on one of the four schools of fiqh, then that gives a bit more of a stability. There's a lot to say, but also one of the benefits is it stops people from fatwa shopping. Going from one position to another position, or just finding positions that suit me. Yeah? He knows that all the scholars are saying this, but let me see if there's another opinion that says halal. Okay, so that I can hear. Well, let me see an opinion that says haram, and I'll stick to that so I can enforce that upon my wife. Yeah, burden people, overburden people. That's a big problem. So when a person sticks to a madhab, it prevents them from doing so. Now, some of the later scholars called or referred to the centuries after the 5th century onwards. They referred to it as the age of taqleed. The age of taqleed. People are just making taqleed in that era. This is what the claim is. People making taqleed. And there's no use, no ijtihad, no using of the sources, no referencing of the Quran, little effort has been put into studying hadith, and so on. Now this claim is a big claim, of course, because that means we're making a judgment on a whole generation, from the 5th century to today, which is what, 1,000 years? Close to 1,000 years. But you'll always find that in every generation people occupy themselves with certain types of knowledge. In certain times throughout Islamic history, for instance, people were very much into philosophy, ilm al-kalam. Yeah, people were very much into it. To the extent that some of the top scholars of Islam were so occupied with philosophy and ilm al-kalam, their whole lives were spent towards this stuff. They regretted it. Many of them regretted it towards the end of their life. Yeah, many of them regretted it towards the end of their life. Similarly, you'll find that during a certain period of time, there was so much focus on the madhab. What does the madhab say? The madhab says this, the madhab says that. The madhab says this, the madhab says that. And sometimes that would lead to some individuals being so occupied with the madhab that maybe they haven't studied a single book of tafsir of the Quran. Maybe they haven't read a single book of hadith cover to cover. All the focus is, we said this, they say this. We say this, they say that. From our companions, Abu Yusuf says this, and Muhammad says this, and so says this, Al-Kasani says this, Qadi Khan says this, Sahib al-Hidayah says this, Sarkhasi says this, he says this, he says that. There's so much focus on what the scholars of a particular madhab say that some people became detached from the texts of the Quran and the words of the Prophet ﷺ, which is no doubt a criticism, definitely. It is a criticism. It has a benefit to it, because at the end of the day, it could be argued that every scholar has his role. There are scholars of fiqh, there are scholars of hadith, there are scholars of tafsir, and there are scholars of a madhab. His role, his specialization is the fiqh of the madhab. So he's contributed for the ummah a preservation of the fiqh of one of the four madhahib and the knowledge of the madhab. That's one thing. Another criticism has been that sometimes it led to people treating the madhab as the sharia. And that's something to realize. The madhab is not the sharia. Yeah? Any one of the four madhahib is not the sharia. Any of the four madhahib is a manifestation and an interpretation of the sharia. Yeah? The four madhahib constitute an interpretation of the sharia of Islam. It's not the sharia itself, because the sharia is perfect and infallible. Whereas the opinions within a madhab could be incorrect and could be completely false. Very possible. Because remember, the people who have contributed towards knowledge of the four madhahib are a huge number of people. Some people are highly qualified, some people are not as knowledgeable, some people are decided to contribute, just as is the case today. And so therefore, those two need to be distinguished. The following of a madhab means that a person is following a valid interpretation of the sharia, but he's not restricted to the sharia. He's not following the sharia 100% necessarily. What does that mean? That means that you can't enforce the views of a madhab on other people as though you're enforcing on them the deen of Allah. That's unfair. Someone else follows a different opinion. Someone else follows a different view. Someone else doesn't agree with this. Someone else doesn't want to follow this view. Why does he have to be obliged to do so? Has he gone against the Quran? And so, when there's an overemphasis on this, on being restricted to one particular madhab, it can sometimes bring that about. Right. There's been back and forth, of course. Scholars have discussed this issue, the age of taqleed, not the age of taqleed, etc. But one of the things that it has brought about is that some scholars have made it wajib to follow one of the four madhab. We spoke about this last week. Yeah? Some scholars made it wajib. Why? They said in order to keep structure. In order to keep structure. And we said that really, most scholars don't consider it wajib, and that following a scholar who is trustworthy and qualified is enough, whether you're following him from a particular madhab or not. Sometimes as well, when a person becomes strict on his madhab, it causes him to interpret the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ in light of that madhab. In light of that madhab. And that can sometimes lead to statements which are highly problematic. For example, Shaykh Ahmad Sawi says in a hashiyah of his, he says it is not permissible to follow any other than the four schools, even if it is the view of a companion, or an authentic hadith, or a verse of the Quran. Because taking with the apparent wording of the Quran and Sunnah is from the foundations of kufr. That's a big statement. It's a big statement. To say that taking the apparent wording of the Quran and Sunnah, قال من أصول الكفر, is from the usul and principles of kufr. That's a huge thing for a Muslim to say. In fact, taking with the apparent wording of the Quran and Sunnah, that's the deen. That's what we've been commanded to do. What he's trying to say is what? He's trying to say that you can't understand the Quran and Sunnah any way you wish. You have to understand it in a certain way. But when that's overemphasized, this type of statement is problematic. It is problematic. A person shouldn't use that type of statement. To say that a person has to follow the four madhahib, is haram for him to go outside any of the four madhahib, even if that's a verse of the Quran or a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ or the position of a companion, because taking with the apparent wording of the Quran and hadith is from the foundations of kufr. So that's problematic. That's considered exaggeration in terms of how to express your opinion. And this is why a number of scholars have strictly criticized this, like Shaykh Muhammad Amin al-Shanqiti in Adwa al-Bayan. And he says this statement of his is from the worst of falsehood. It's from the worst of falsehood to make such a big statement. As we said, the obligation is to follow what? The obligation is to follow a trusted scholar, whether from a madhab or not from a madhab. And this is something that the Hanbalis have said, the Shafi'is have said, Imam al-Nawawi has said it. Imam Ahmad himself said, لا تحمل الناس على مذهبك. Don't enforce your madhab on people. When it comes to dealing with evidences, opinions of scholars and evidences, we say that the scholar or the alim or the mufti, he should have an encompassing knowledge of the Quran and an encompassing knowledge of the ahadith, and he should have an encompassing knowledge of the opinions of the scholars, because he is now going to give you a summary of the sharia of Allah. If you ask a mufti a question, he's going to give you a summary of Islam on that particular issue. So he's got to have a strong understanding of Islam in order to be able to do that. Because anyone can copy and paste. Anyone can hear an opinion or listen to an opinion and just send it over to you. That's not sufficient. The difference between that individual and the scholar is that the scholar looks at your case specifically and gives you the most appropriate ruling for that particular circumstance. That's the scholar. The student of knowledge, someone who's studying sharia, someone who's studying fiqh, someone who's studying hadith, for him, he's going to continue studying until he becomes more and more knowledgeable. At the beginning, he's going to be most reliant on his teacher. That's the nature of learning, because most of your knowledge comes from your teacher. So you're going to be influenced easily by your teacher, because his knowledge is strong, your knowledge is weak. You're a beginner, he's someone who's a scholar, so he can convince you easily. So anything he says, you'll believe it. And anything he argues, you'll sound like a strong argument. And so you're just going to follow that to begin with. But as you develop more and more and more, you will find that there is now more and more disagreement. There's more and more disagreement. You might not be convinced so easily. Now you have more questions. Now you raise more issues. Now you might even hold views that don't agree with your teacher's views. And this is what happened. This is why the students of all the scholars disagreed with them on a number of issues. Why? Because they continued studying until they were capable of doing so. Finally, the average Muslim, who's not a student of knowledge and not a scholar necessarily, but he wants to follow the religion on any particular issue. His role is to do what? Is to ask a person of knowledge that he trusts. And we've said that over and over again. The ruling on talfiq. What's talfiq? Talfiq means that you take one opinion from one madhab and another opinion from another madhab. Yeah? So for example, you vomit, and you also touch your private parts. And you don't make wudu at all. You pray without making wudu. If you vomit and touch your private parts, your wudu has broken according to the Hanbali school and the Shafi'i school and the Maliki school and the Hanafi school. Because in the Hanafi madhab, vomiting breaks wudu. And in the Hanbali madhab and the Maliki madhab and the Shafi'i madhab, touching the private parts breaks wudu. And vomiting breaks the wudu according to the Hanbali school as well. So now if you vomit and touch your privates and you don't make wudu, that means you've gone against all the four madhab. Some scholars said that's not permissible. Why is it not permissible? Because you are now going against all of these views, all of them. However, a number of scholars have said there's no issue. So long as the reason why a person is doing talfiq is because he's asked a trustworthy scholar, and not because he's trying to play around with the religion. And this is something that one of the Hanbali scholars of the 11th century argued, and he wrote a whole fatwa arguing for this. Shaykh al-Karmi, who is one of the leading authorities in the Hanbali method. How does that work? It works. You ask a Hanafi mufti, you say, Shaykh, if a person touches their private parts, do they have to make wudu? He says no. And then a while later you ask a scholar, and you say, if someone throws up, do they have to make wudu? He says no, you don't have to make wudu. According to Imam Malik, you don't have to make wudu. Shafi'i, you don't have to make wudu. So you've asked this scholar for this issue, you've asked that scholar for that issue. Are you going around trying to seek out what suits you and to do the bare minimum? No, that's not your intention. That's not your intention. In fact, you might not even know in your mind, is this the Hanafi view, is this the Maliki view, you don't have a clue. You just asked the scholar, he said it doesn't break wudu. You asked a different scholar on another occasion, he said it doesn't break wudu. Alhamdulillah. So there's no issue. So the rule is what? The overriding principle is what? A person asks a scholar, a person of knowledge, without playing around and trying to mess about with the religion. If they've done that, that's fine. Whether it's consistent with their madhab or not consistent with their madhab. And we said there's a difference of opinion on this issue. So what I say today, another person might say something different, no problem. But we say this is the position that is ruled in the Hanbali school by the Hanbali scholars and many other imams. And it's also more appropriate. Why? Because for people to follow and to make taqleed and to follow scholars, that's based on ease. It's based on making things easy for people. The whole point behind it, the whole point behind him being allowed to ask a person of knowledge, is that his own knowledge is limited, it's restricted. So therefore he's been given a concession to ask another scholar and just follow whatever that scholar says. So similarly, we don't say to him he has to follow things in this particular way or that particular way. So long as we said, he's doing it in the proper way. Do we have any comments so far?
السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام.
نفترض إذا كان في عندي مشكلة.
نعم.
بصير أتبع يعني إذا مذهب المالكي إذا بيناسبني.
نعم.
إذا ما بيناسبني بصير أتبع مذهب الحنفي.
نعم.
يجوز ولا لا؟
And the question is, can I follow one madhab if it suits me and then a different madhab if it suits me? There's a difference between talfiq, and you farraq between talfiq, and between what we called last week, what we refer to as tatabbu' al-rukhas. فرق بين التلفيق والتتبع الرخص. تتبع الرخص لا يجوز باتفاق العلماء. Why? Because تتبع الرخص means you're going out seeking whichever view helps you. Why is this not allowed? Why is this not allowed? Because we've been commanded to follow the Prophet ﷺ. The only reason we've been given a concession to follow people, ask people of knowledge, is because we believe they will be able to explain to us the Prophet ﷺ's teaching on this issue. That's why. I don't follow a scholar because of him. Who's he? He's not perfect, he's not infallible. I just trust that he has knowledge of the Prophet ﷺ's sunnah. And this is why I've been allowed to go to him. In the case of tatabbu' al-rukhas, I'm following whatever suits me. Now my intention is no longer to follow the messenger. أصبحت النية الآن فقط التسهيل على النفس. يعني ما صارت النية أن يتبع الإنسان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم كما أمر. And so that's where there's a problem here. So تتبع الرخص we said is prohibited. Talfiq we said is a concession. Where sometimes you follow this madhab and sometimes you follow that madhab, so long as it's not with the intention of تتبع الرخص. فإذا سأل مفتي مالكي مثلا قال له هذا يجوز. في مسألة أخرى سأل حنفي قال له هذا يجوز له يتبع هذا القول وهذا القول لأنه لم يقصد التتبع. مفهوم هذا؟
بالضبط. ضربت مثال كذا واحد يعني كوميتي إذا الحنبلي والمالكي متفقين عليه معناته هذا التلفيق. شو يعني التلفيق بالضبط؟
تلفيق يعني he's asking about what تلفيق is. تلفيق is to do something which is not acceptable in any of the four madhab. if you collect it together. Yeah, you do something and as a whole, this is not acceptable in any of the four madhahib. مثل هذا المثال. يعني now if you touch your privates and you don't make wudu, is there a valid opinion which allows you to pray without making wudu after touching your privates? Yes, there is. There is. But now if you add to it vomiting, and you add to it eating camel meat, and you add to it touching a woman, and you add to it, and you go on and on, all of them are valid opinions individually. But when you gather them together, no scholar now allows this. No scholar allows it in this particular way you have gathered all these views. But we say even if no scholar allows it like that, if it is not done with the intention of tatabbu' al-rukhas, it is permitted. Because you have done what is required of you, and that is to ask a person of knowledge. فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ. If it is done with the intention of tatabbu' al-rukhas, let me find the easiest view on this, and the easiest view on this, and the easiest view on this, and now it's not permissible. Because now your intention is not to follow the religion of Allah. Your intention now is to do what you want to do, and you're finding a justification. Justification. That means the scholar's opinion might as well not be there in the first place. But you're using the scholar's opinion in order to say, well, he says it's allowed. So your intention is no longer to follow the Sharia. Your intention is simply to justify what you're doing and to make an excuse. Now,
would you also comment on whether an individual would ask a Shaykh in another country, for example, back in Asia or from Asia or in the Arab world, as opposed to asking their country of residence?
No.
Is the answer likely to differ, even if it's the same method
no.
that he's asking?
So that's a question on asking a scholar from a different country. The rule is that you ask the people of knowledge of your country. That's the general rule. You ask the people of knowledge of your country. Why is that the general rule? Because when Allah Ta'ala sends messengers, He says, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا قَبْلَكَ مِنْ رَسُولٍ إِلَّا بِلِسَانِ قَوْمِهِ. Whenever we have sent a messenger before you, we have sent him with the tongue of his people. Why? لِيُبَيِّنَ لَهُمْ. So that he can clarify to them. He can clarify to them. Now, a lot of the time, asking a person of knowledge from a different country means that your answer, the answer he gives you, is going to be based on his understanding of your question. His understanding of your question might be incorrect, completely incorrect. And this is why so many times will a scholar from Saudi Arabia, for example, give a fatwa on an issue in Algeria. Yeah? On an issue in Algeria. When some of the Algerian students of knowledge go to him in Saudi Arabia, they say, Shaykh, how can you give a fatwa like this? Why is this prohibited? He says, because this. He says, no, but in our country it's not like that. In our country it's like this. In our country this is the issue. For now this mufti from a different country has given a fatwa based on how he views it, how he understands the concept, the reality. But the reality is not how it is. And the one who's living that environment will have a better understanding of that scenario. That doesn't mean it's haram to ask people of knowledge outside, because sometimes some issues are common issues. Some issues are common issues which might not necessarily differ from place to place. And the trustworthy mufti will not answer questions easily unless he really confirms what's happening in your country. And ideally he'll refer you to another person of knowledge in that country.
There's a specific problem for Western people that live in Western.
That's right, and the situation for Muslims in the West is specific. It is specific, because if you ask someone in a Muslim land, an Arab country, or a country from Pakistan, for instance, or Bangladesh, maybe their environment is an environment where Islam is dominant. Islam is authoritative. The country runs in a certain way. The state runs in a certain way. Politics is a certain way. Here, that's completely different. Politics is different, customs are different, cultures are different, the reality is different. The influence of Islam is different. And it's a big and a bad mistake to think that because someone lives in a certain country, they're less qualified. And some people think that. They think that because somebody is living in Leicester or in Leeds or in Manchester or in London, he must be less knowledgeable than the one who lives in Mecca or Riyadh or Medina. Why? Who said so? Some of the greatest scholars of Islam lived in Andalus, Spain. They lived in Portugal. They lived in all sorts of areas of the world. People say this about other Muslim countries. People say this about other Muslim countries. Some people say things like the scholars of North Africa there are no scholars in North Africa. Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, there are no scholars there. Where are the scholars? The scholars are in Mecca, Medina and Riyadh. Why? Why are they the scholars? Maybe a scholar in Morocco or Tunisia is 100 times more knowledgeable than a scholar in Mecca. Is that prohibited? Impossible? Maybe a scholar in Egypt is much more knowledgeable than a scholar of Riyadh. Is that impossible? There's no, that's a bad misunderstanding. That's a bad claim as well. It's inaccurate, it's incorrect, and there's no proof for it at all. The ibrah is with knowledge. If a person is a person of knowledge, he's a person of knowledge, whether he lives in the UK, whether he lives elsewhere. And the rule is to ask people of knowledge in the country. That's the general rule. Sometimes you can still benefit, of course, from other people of knowledge. There's no harm, there's no issue. But as a general rule, a person asks the people of their country. And you'll find that if you read up on the fatwa of the scholars, they always emphasize that. Emphasize going to your scholars, going to these scholars, going to these scholars. طيب. Sisters, any comments? We have a number of scholars who were highly critical of madhab taqleed throughout the history of Islam. From them, and from the earliest is Imam Ibn Hazm, Abu Muhammad Ibn Hazm, the Zahiri scholar from Andalus, from Spain. He was highly critical of taqleed of the four madhahib. He found that people were strictly following the madhahib, and he found that they're exaggerating and going over the top. And he found that people are not so strong in their knowledge of the Quran and ahadith, and they're just following madhab. My madhab says this, my madhab says that. He was very upset about that. And this is why his book Al-Muhalla Bil-Athar, which is an encyclopedia of fiqh, and it's a very important book. He's very critical. And his nature is a harsh nature anyway. His approach is very harsh. So he doesn't just criticize or disagree with opinions, he really attacks opinions. Sometimes even opinions held by big scholars. He'll mention the opinion of Abu Hanifa, or the opinion of Malik, or the opinion of another scholar, and he'll say, وَهَذَا هُوَ الْبَاطِلُ بِعَيْنِهِ. And this is falsehood, the definition of falsehood. That's his approach. He has a very strict and very harsh approach. And it's not just him. It's not just him. Scholars from the four madhahib some of them have that nature as well. Shaykh Taqiyuddin al-Subki from the Shafi'i scholars, who was one of the students of Imam al-Dhahabi, he had this as well. He had this harshness and strictness also about him for certain opinions, to the extent that he called the opinions of some of the Hanbalis, he said that these are opinions of polytheists. And some other scholars as well said about the Shafi'i madhab, some of the Hanafi scholars said about some of the opinions in the Shafi'i madhab, قال وهذا أشبه بقول المجوس من قول أهل الإسلام. This opinion is closer to the opinion of the Majus than the opinion of Islam. This is the opinion of Shafi'i himself. And there's that harshness. Shaykh Zahed al-Kawthari, contemporary Hanafi scholar, he calls Kitab al-Tawheed by Ibn Khuzaymah, he says هذا كتاب الشرك. It's not Kitab al-Tawheed, it's Kitab al-Shirk. So you find that type of sometimes statement from scholars around. And it's not something to be too shook about, because it happens. People, these are human beings. They're trying to defend something or an opinion, so they end up being excessively critical. So Ibn Hazm was one of those who was very critical of following the four madhab, especially because he lived in Andalus. Andalus was following which madhab? The Maliki madhab. So Ibn Hazm and the Malikis were always head to head, always, constantly head to head. So they were always back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Ibn Hazm had his views and the Malikis had their views. Ibn Hazm their views. A bit like modern day, the Hanafis and Ahl Hadith in India and Pakistan. Similar to that constant back and forth. These guys are like that, and these guys are like that. These guys are like that, and these guys are like that. And subhanAllah, someone who, of course, for some people that can be hurtful. And it can be something that causes confusion for some people. But it shouldn't. Don't allow that type of thing to cause confusion. That's the academic discussion, discourse between scholars. There's a lot to actually benefit from there. And when one of our teachers, who's a Hanbali, and he holds certain opinions, particularly opinions in Aqeedah. As-Subki called those opinions, and he cursed those who hold those opinions. And our Shaykh Kareem, his name is, he's explaining to us and mentioning these statements from As-Subki. He says, but no problem. Al-Imam Subki, rahimahullah, even though he says this about us, say no problem. He's still a alim, he's still a scholar. But when someone is speaking in that type of mode, in debate mode, they always tend to cross the boundaries. And that was one of the greatest lessons that we took from him. That even if you hear a person of knowledge making a statement that's very harsh or very strict, it could be on another scholar. It could be something said about another scholar. It's not something to make a huge thing about. It's just to realize that these are human beings and they can sometimes become excessive or less excessive. From those who are similar to Ibn Hazm in being strict against taqleed of the madhahib is Al-Amir San'ani and Al-Imam Shawkani as well as in more recent times the Al-Hadith scholars of India in the subcontinent. And of course, similar to Ibn Hazm's situation, like we said, they were also faced with a majority Hanafi country, and so there was that back and forth, just like it was with Ibn Hazm in Andalus. As well as that, the Salafi da'wah in Najd. The Salafi da'wah in Najd is also known to have some scholars who are highly critical of madhab taqleed, even though generally speaking they are from a Hanbali background as a general rule. And the fiqh in that country is based on the fiqh of the Hanbalis. But there are certain opinions held by the scholars of Najd from the time of Shaykh Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab till today. And those opinions are the ones that are relied upon in Najd, in modern day Saudi Arabia. Those are the views that are relied upon. And sometimes there isn't a strong criticism of madhab taqleed from some of the scholars of the Salafi da'wah in Najd. And there are different levels. From the contemporary scholars as well, Shaykh Muhammad Abdul, Egyptian scholar, who's sometimes considered as a type of modernist in his approach, and his student, Shaykh Muhammad Rashid Rida. Both of them were scholars. Shaykh Muhammad Abdul was Shaykh al-Azhar. He was the Mufti of al-Azhar. And he was someone who wrote a number of books. Shaykh Muhammad Rashid Rida also has a book in tafsir called Tafsir al-Manar. And he has a majalla, like a magazine, which used to be published constantly over a period of, I think, 35 years. Majallat al-Manar. And now it's been printed in around 30 or 35 volumes. A huge encyclopedia filled with different issues. And some of our mashayikh really encourage this book. He's different from the mainstream in his approach sometimes. And he has obviously some views which contradict the mainstream views. But again, there isn't that madhab background. There isn't that madhab sort of taqleed. And Shaykh Muhammad Rashid Rida also influenced some of the modern day movements, like the Muslim Brotherhood, Jama'at Ikhwan, which is led by Shaykh Hassan al-Banna, rahimahullah. He was also one of those who contributed towards writing in Majallat al-Manar, which was initially founded by Shaykh Muhammad Rashid Rida. And Shaykh Hassan al-Banna's approach, which is of course very influential in the Muslim world today, the Muslim Brotherhood, again doesn't have that strict madhab background approach. Whereas other modern movements do have a strong madhab background, like some of the movements in the Hanafi, some of the Hanafi movements, for instance, like the Deobandi movement and the Braylwi movement. They're modern day sort of, you could guess, schools. You could say schools, modern day schools, but they are based on, and they come from a background and a foundation of madhab. One particular madhab. So the point is, the discussion on the four madhahib is becoming more and more of a discussion today. Today it's becoming much of a discussion because fiqh has changed, and there's been a change to fiqh in recent times. the sticking, where you used to have one country is one madhab, and they have one grand mufti, and they have one body of scholars, all of them upon one madhab. That isn't really that much the case today. And this is why, inshallah, in the next lesson, we'll look at this concept of moving away from the madhahib. Are people moving away from the four madhahib? Are people following the four madhahib at all? Are people, the influence of the four schools of fiqh, are they there the way they used to be? Or is it just almost become a historical type of way that people used to follow fiqh? طبعا, as you know, it's not a historical thing because the majority of people today are still following fiqh according to one of the four madhahib. But there's no doubt that changes have occurred. Why have changes occurred? Few influential names have caused that. Few influential names, or let's not say caused, they contributed. And we mentioned some today. We mentioned Ibn Hazm, we mentioned Al-San'ani, Al-Shawkani, Shaykh Siddiq Hassan Khan, considered one of the leading Imams of Ahl Hadith in the subcontinent, as well as the Salafi Da'wah in Najd, and as well as the more modern approach of a Shaykh Muhammad Rashid Rida and a Shaykh Muhammad Abdah, which was then developed and followed by Shaykh Hassan al-Banna and various others. Anyhow, inshallah ta'ala, in the next lesson, we have only a few points to mention, and we'll finish this program in the next week, inshallah ta'ala. And we'll look at some contemporary approaches to fiqh of the fiqh councils. We'll look at the fiqh councils that we have today, which didn't really exist then. We'll look at what's known as minority fiqh al-aqalliyat, and we'll look at what's called as fiqh al-taysir. Some people have referred to it as the fiqh of taysir, the fiqh of ease, making things easy. We'll look at who are the scholars who are leading these types of approaches, and we'll also link it to how the madhahib, the four madhahib have developed when it comes to this issue. طيب, barakallahu feekum. Next lesson, inshallah ta'ala, is Isha at the same time?
We can extend. Is it? No, 8:04.
Next Friday.
No. But now.
Next week is 8:15, is it?
Next week.
طيب, shall we spend 15 minutes and finish the whole topic?
No, whatever you happy.
Or shall we leave some...
Because I think once the questions...
طيب, خلاص. So shall we open up any comments then or questions?
Yes.
خلاص, يلا. Who has a comment on anything we've got? تفضل.
What would be the problem for anybody to look for easy solutions indeed, as long as it doesn't against Quran or Hadith? I specifically, for example, would want to go and find an easy fiqh of myself. I have an issue. I'm going to keep asking until I have a solution that it suits me as well as not clashing with the deen. I've heard it from, for example, from Maliki. I'm not convinced. I'm keep going till I find a hadith from any madhab.
Any madhab?
And until the hadith is authentic,
No.
the solution is good.
طيب.
So what's the problem?
Yeah. So the question here is, what's the issue in going around searching for opinions that are easy and that suit me, so long as it doesn't clash with clear teachings of the Quran or clear ahadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Generally speaking, as we said, the objective is to follow the Sharia. That's the objective. The command is to follow the Sharia. اتبعوا ما أنزل إليكم من ربكم. Follow that which has been revealed to you from your Lord. Now, when scholars disagree, are all of them correct? If scholars disagree on an issue, Imam Malik says touching the private parts breaks wudu. Abu Hanifa says touching the private parts doesn't break wudu. Are they both correct? How can they both be correct?
Exactly.
It's a different certain issues in the deen, which something issued to certain people in a certain incident.
But both of them are saying this is a general statement, as a general rule. It's not like somebody comes to a mufti and says, you know what, I've just gone and made wudu and I accidentally touched my private parts. And now I'm going to have to go all the way, and maybe there's traffic in the way and a huge audience like in the Haram. In Mecca, if you lose your wudu, in Mecca that's another 15-minute trip just to make wudu. So we're not talking about an individual case. Maybe in that case I hold the view that touching the privates break wudu. But in this case, for this person, I say don't worry about it, just pray. It doesn't break a wudu. Because I've looked at his circumstance and considered that to be appropriate for him. But we're saying as a general fatwa, a general hukum. Malik says touching the private parts, whoever it is, breaks the wudu. Abu Hanifa says touching the private doesn't break wudu. Doesn't matter what type of situation you're in. These are contradicting opinions. It's therefore not possible for both to be correct. If we ask the Prophet ﷺ, he'll give us one answer. He won't give us two answers. He'll give us one. And that's why the position of the vast majority of scholars is that when there's a difference of opinion, the truth is one. The truth is one. Are all of these opinions acceptable opinions? Yes, they're acceptable. That's the difference. There's a difference between true and between acceptable. Now, we've been commanded to follow revelation. If I am following simply based on what's easy, that means I don't care whether this is correct or incorrect. That's my attitude, the way you've described it. The attitude here is, I don't care whether it's correct or incorrect. I simply want to follow this. I want this to be halal. I want this to be halal. I want to do it. I'm not interested, is it correct? Is it incorrect? Is it false? Because at the end of the day, as I said, any person who has a bit of knowledge will be able to convince someone who has less knowledge, even if they're convincing them of an opinion that is completely false. Completely false. You can even convince another person of an opinion that's shirk or kufr. Why? Because he can't distinguish. He's not going to be able to distinguish, is this an authentic hadith or not an authentic hadith? Is this how you should understand the hadith, or is this not how to understand the hadith? Is this actually a verse of the Quran or not? He doesn't know. Is this actually a verse of the Quran or not? So, the attitude of the one who says, I'm going to follow any opinion I wish, so long as it suits me, the attitude is a problem in itself. Because that attitude is an attitude of, I'm not interested in following what's correct and what's true and what's most beloved to Allah. I'm interested in following what I want. And now I just need a justification. And Allah Ta'ala, when He criticized the Jews in the Quran, why did He criticize them? He didn't criticize them for going against clear text, because they played with the text. They played with the texts of the Torah in order to overcome and play around and get around the ruling. You can do that as well. Yani, you might, to them, at least they had a bit of taqwa. They had a bit of taqwa. They didn't want to go against the religion in an explicit way. They wanted to do a bit of a hila, a bit of a plan to get around it. That's the same thing here. That's the same thing here. Because you can easily justify not going with this verse, or not going with the hadith, or not going with the opinion of the majority of scholars, or maybe not going with the opinion of all the Sahaba, for instance. Why? Because, alhamdulillah, he has a justification. He has a proof. He has some proof. That's a problem. However, if there is a situation where a person finds haraj and difficulty, now if you find that taking with a different opinion that's easier for you, and it doesn't clash with clear teachings, there is scope. There is scope. And I mentioned to you last week the incident of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, when someone came to him and asked him a question, and Ahmad said, impermissible. And he said to him, Tayyib, what if I ask those scholars and they allow me? He said, if you go to the halqa of the Madani scholars, if they allow you, then take with it. You can go with it. So he sees that this individual wants an easier opinion, but still he gave him that concession. Why? Because he's not going against an explicit text, and number two, he was in a situation which was a situation of hardship. But if it becomes a constant practice, then that means your attitude is not an attitude of the servant of Allah. It's now an attitude of following desire. And you can make anything permissible. And there are some opinions that have been written in the books of fiqh throughout Islamic history that are opinions that if they were to be spoken about in front of some people, they might collapse and fall unconscious. That these opinions are mentioned by scholars of Islam. Well, why? Because human beings. وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. Anything that's not from Allah will always have lots of difference in it. But one question, then we'll come to the topic. You had your hand up first, and then ولو أفتاك الناس وأفتوك. نعم. The hadith of follow your heart. استفتي قلبك. even if people give you a fatwa. That's in cases of clear uncertainty. A person of knowledge gives you a ruling and says it's permissible for you to do this, and you're still not convinced. You think that I struggle to accept this. No problem. You don't have to take with it. You don't have to take with it if you want to be extra cautious about your religion, because the Prophet ﷺ encouraged us to keep away from doubtful matters. فَمَنِ اتَّقَى الشُّبُهَاتِ فَقَدْ اسْتَبْرَأَ لِدِينِهِ وَعِرْضِهِ. But nonetheless, you're putting this person of knowledge between you and Allah, and therefore if he gives you something, even if he says it's permissible or gives you a lenient opinion, you can take it. And going against your madhab or trying to find a solution is fine, if done occasionally, if done at times of need, if done at times of necessity. It's understandable, because you're not going against the Sharia, you're going against the opinion of a scholar. However, if it becomes your constant nature and your constant practice, what does that show? That shows there's neglect. There's no interest in following what is true. And so we distinguish between constantly doing it and between someone who occasionally takes with a different opinion for the sake of ease. Right.
I think the other problem with fatwa shopping is the fact that it may instill doubt in your heart. If you do ask another scholar about the same question, you may still have that ignorant feeling, maybe he was right and I shouldn't have done that. So that's just the comment I wanted to make. My actual question is, the Salafi school and the Shaykh Abd and Shaykh Baraz, are there...
Shaykh who? Muhammad Abda?
Shaykh Banna?
Shaykh Hassan Banna, founder of the Muslim Brotherhood?
Yeah. Are their ideas classed under an umbrella term like the Zahiri, or how are they known?
لا, يعني the movement, the Salafi da'wah of Najd, sometimes referred to as the Wahhabi da'wah, Wahhabi movement. Essentially what? It's opinions influenced by Shaykh Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. He's considered the father of this sort of da'wah, and he has his student and followers. They explicitly say they're Hanbali. They say they're Hanbali. So as a general rule, they're followers of the Hanbali method, as a general rule. However, there are opinions held by the scholars and the fuqaha of this school which are not considered the mainstream positions of the Hanbali method. Many of the opinions held by Shaykh Muhammad ibn Ibrahim, held by Shaykh ibn Baz, held by Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen, before them Shaykh Abdul Rahman ibn Hassan, Shaykh Hamad ibn Atiq, before them Shaykh Abdullah al-Abtain, and various other scholars of this da'wah and this movement. Many of their opinions are not consistent with the mu'tamad or the relied upon opinion of the Hanbali school. But as a general ethos, there is a Hanbali approach. And they differ, by the way. Not every Salafi scholar is one person. They have different approaches themselves. And some of them lean more towards the Hanbali madhab, like Shaykh Abdullah bin Aqil. Yeah? Very, very much follower of the Hanbali positions. And others oppose the Hanbali positions on many issues, like Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen. Very much opposed the Hanbali positions on a lot of issues. And Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen was very much influenced by Shaykh Islam ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim. And a lot of the times he would take with their tarjihat. And of course his own teacher, who was the Shaykh Abdul Rahman al-Sa'di. And some of them do lean towards the Zahiri madhab in a way. So that comes into it also. But they're different. Some of them lean towards some of them you could say are a mixture between Hanbali and Zahiri. And others you could say are a mixture between following the madhab of Ibn Hazm and between the Hanbali school and between the Shafi'i school, or between some of the scholars of Hadith, like Ibn Khuzaymah and Ibn Hibban. And so on. They differ. But the point is, it's around this area. Hanbali as a general approach, but many opinions might go against the Hanbali school. Shaykh Hassan Banna, Shaykh Muhammad Abdah and Shaykh Muhammad Rashid Rida, they're different. They're different. And these two approaches are different schools. Although there's some overlap to an extent. When it comes to the movement of Shaykh Muhammad Abd, when I say movement, I'm using it loosely. I'm not using it as it's an official movement, but it's a school, students and followers, etc. This approach of Muhammad Rashid Rida and Shaykh Hassan al-Banna is not one bound by any particular method. It's not bound by a particular method. And that's why, even within the Muslim Brotherhood, even within the movement of the Ikhwan, you'll find people who are from all the different madhab. You'll find people who are Hanafi and Shafi'i and Maliki and Hanbali. And you'll find people who are very Athari in their approach, and you'll find people who are closer to being Ash'ari. And you'll find people who are perhaps even Zahiri in their approach. And so on. So the objective of the Muslim Brotherhood isn't so much to have certain fiqhi opinions that everyone has to follow. And therefore you won't find that strict following of any particular madhab when it comes to that. Allah Ta'ala. And all of it is, of course, these discussions for some people are too controversial discussions to have, but they shouldn't be controversial. It's important to have an understanding of how knowledge develops and history and things like that, which helps in understanding how knowledge develops. Final comment, inshallah, and then we'll break for salah.
How big a role does politics have to play
how big a role does politics have to play in the development of fiqh? No doubt, a big influence. And this is why you'll find the scholars throughout history have always been warning each other from being too close to leaders. And sometimes being close to a leader forces you to say things that if you weren't so close, you wouldn't have said it. You wouldn't have said it. By the way, not every scholar who is influenced by a leader or a state, it doesn't necessarily mean, we also are quick to rush and attack. Straight away, if we hear someone who gives a ruling that's consistent with the state or something, we straight away rush and attack them as being hypocrites. Either awliya Allah al-muttaqeen or hypocrite, are they the only options? Either this or that. That's also rushing in rashly and unnecessarily and unfairly. The point here is, for some people, if they are too close to a state or an authority, they will interpret their actions in a good light. So other people might see that this king, or this ruler, or this prime minister, he's a criminal, or he's evil, or he's that. The scholar who has been treated well by this leader or authority, he thinks well of him, and he's just given me £2 million and said, go and teach hadith with this. I want all your time spent in teaching hadith, teaching the sunnah. Of course you're going to have a good opinion of this person. And this is why the scholars were always encouraging other scholars to be cautious about entering the doors of rulers. Some scholars would even reject a hadith and reject knowledge from other scholars. They said he visits the rulers too much. He's always at their palace. He's always visiting. And that's understandable because it will sometimes influence your views. It's a difficult area to pinpoint and say he's a state scholar or he's a scholar that's influenced by this or that. But it happens. And for some people it's disastrous. For some people it's disastrous. It's clear that their opinions and their rulings and their views are excessive in support, for instance, of a particular leader or a state. And for others, we shouldn't be quick to make that type of judgment or claim. But no doubt, politics is powerful and influential. And that's what...
Does it go the other way as well? Like some
excessively against. That's right. Some scholars are excessively against. So now, even if a state does something which is acceptable in the Sharia, they will say it's haram. Why is it haram? Because it's that state. And that king is corrupt. So anything he does is corrupt. And this is why I like the advice of Shaykh Abu Hassan al-Nadwi, rahimahullah, on this issue. His advice to scholars, he says, don't be an explicit enemy to the state. And also don't be too close to the state. But be someone who's balanced. Be balanced. Be a free scholar, be a person of knowledge who speaks for the sake of Allah. And don't be excessive in being pro-state and don't be excessive in being anti. Because if you're anti over the top, that will also have an impact on your opinions. And it will also have an impact on the things that you say. And if you're pro too much or anti too much, it will also work that way. And as I said, it's a discussion that requires further study and further look into it. Jazakumullah khair. Barakallahu feekum. And as same with next week inshallah, we start at 7 o'clock and finish at Isha bi-idhnillah. Allahu a'lam.